Hey, what's up, everybody? This is Astrid here. For those of you that don't know me, I'm a poet, a writer, an author, and a journalist. Some of you may recognize me from the spring session with AGW as your former host. But today, I wanted to just let you all know a little bit about what we do here at AGW for those that are not familiar. So, AGW, or Awful Good Writers, is a creative community that's connecting our participants through a wide network of writers all over the world, nationally and internationally. So the way it works is we have some of the best poets from all around the world facilitate 4-week course workshops. And these workshops are basically intended to improve the lived experiences of our participants through creative writing. And so in just a bit, I'm going to go ahead and have one of those poets join me in a conversation, for those of you that saw the flyer earlier. And we're basically just going to go into who he is and what his workshop is going to be consisting of. So for those of you that already know who I'm talking about, it's none other than Rudy Francisco, who I'm going to introduce in just a little bit. But for those of you that for some reason don't know who he is, he's one of the most recognizable names in spoken word poetry, born and raised in San Diego, where he is also a co-host at his home venue, Queen Bee's Art and Cultural Center. And you may also recognize him from some legendary TV shows such as Verses and Flow, as well as The Tonight Show with Jimmy Fallon. And so he has a workshop starting this Monday, July 12th at 3 p.m. And it's going to kick off our summer sessions with Awful Good Writers. So for those of you that haven't signed up yet, make sure you stay tuned because we're going to go into more details about what that looks like, but also who is Rudy Francisco? Who is he as a person, right? And so if you're on the fence a little bit, just keep watching. That way you can get to know who he is and see if it's the right fit for you. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and bring in Rudy. And let's see where he's at. Hey, Rudy.
Hey, what's up? How you doing?
What's up? I'm good. How are you?
I'm good. I'm good. I can't complain.
All right, let me just fix the audio. Can't really hear you. Okay, there we go.
How's that better?
Yeah, cool. All right. So as I mentioned before, Rudy is born and raised in San Diego. So tell us what that was like for you growing up as a kid. We want to know more about who you were before the poetry came along.
Oh yeah. I was raised by two immigrant parents. Both of my parents are born and raised in Belize. And my father, he actually moved. Well, he had joined the military, so he was stationed at Camp Pendleton, which is right outside of San Diego in Oceanside. So like my mother chose to move her and my brother to San Diego. And later on, like I was the first kid born in the U.S. So growing up, I had like two extremely hardworking parents. They really raised me to believe that like anything is possible, because since like my mother grew up without electricity, you know what I mean? She grew up in a village, and she was like, well, since you're here in America and you have so many opportunities, you should be taking advantage of those as much as possible. So she always like pushed me and always told me that like, no matter what, like anything is within your reach, everything's within your grasp. So yeah, I've kind of just always had that in mind. I think that's why being a full-time poet wasn't such like an odd thing for me to imagine, because my whole
Mhm.
life, my mother has sort of instilled in me this idea that anything is possible.
That's awesome. It's so good to have supportive mom.
Mhm. Oh yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. Absolutely.
So then at what point did you know you wanted to become a poet?
Yeah.
When did
Yeah.
that?
I wrote my first poem when I was 17 years old. I was a senior in high school, and we were given the assignment to write a poem. Bring it back, you get full credit. So I wrote this poem about this girl that I had a crush on, named Rochelle Moss, and yeah, I brought it back the next day. My friend Samantha, we had arrived to the class before everybody else did. So she was like, "Hey, let me read your poem," right? So I give it to her. She reads it. She tells me that she likes it. I don't really think much about it. And then the whole class sort of files in. We go through our entire lesson. And then the teacher asks if anybody wants to read their poems out loud before they turn them in. So Samantha, she's like nudging me. She's like, yo, you should read your poem. And I was like, no, absolutely not. We kind of went back and forth for a minute. And she says, well, what about if I read it for you? Right. So I was like, cool, you could do that. So she gets up and she reads the poem and the class claps, which was like wild because, we're, 17, 16 years old and we're at the age where we hate everything, So the class clapping for the poem actually it made me feel good about it. And then afterwards, my teacher pulls me aside and she's like, wow, like that was a really good poem. You should consider writing more often. But I didn't really start writing more until I had gone off to college. So my first year in the dorms as a freshman, randomly we had HBO, right, which was wild because I mean most dorms don't have HBO. We only had like 3 or 4 channels, and one of them just happened to be HBO, which is hella
Yeah.
random. But that was the situation. And at that time, HBO Def Poetry had just started to come on, and it was on HBO. So randomly stumbled across an episode of HBO Def Poetry. First poet I ever saw was Shihan. And I just absolutely was just blown away by the show. And I used to be obsessed with it. I used to watch it all the time. And that was what really made me, think about like, oh, like this could be like a thing, you know what I mean? So I started hosting an open mic at my university, started going to other, open mics around the city. And that's really how I got introduced to the craft. I met some really amazing people and had some really phenomenal people mentor me, Christopher Wilson, Kendrick Dial, and Black, Shihan, of course, Javon Johnson, and so many people from the community just really took me under their wing. And, I got a chance to learn from some really phenomenal people. So, yeah,
That's awesome. No, you
definitely.
know you're inspired by legends. That
Hmm.
definitely how you found your path towards success. But what I think is really interesting, a lot of people
Hmm.
don't know, is
Yeah.
you actually struggled with speech impediment growing up.
Oh, yeah.
And
Yeah,
so
definitely.
overcome that to be the well-spoken poet that you are today.
Well, I still stutter every now and then. It still creeps up on me. It still happens. But yeah, when I was younger, like I had a really, really like bad speech impediment, and part of it was because I was just nervous in front of crowds. And I remember being in like the third grade and like having to like read a part of a story. And basically when like the class is reading a book, everybody sort of has to like pick like a couple lines to read, and I would dread those days because of my stutter. And I remember one time just like stumbling through like an entire sentence. It took me forever, and the teacher had to like step in and be like, oh, it's okay, and like read the sentence for me. And I remember the first time I did the presentation in college, I practiced for it, and I got up there and I just like blanked completely, and I stuttered through the whole thing, and it was just like a really traumatic experience for me. So even being like somebody who speaks in public now is such a it's such a surprise to anybody who knew me like before around like 2007. You know what I mean? But yeah, it was something that I just had to work on and try to work through.
Yeah.
A lot of it has to do with just like practicing. Like when I'm getting ready to do a poem, like I practice it over and over and over, and that makes me feel more prepared for the situation. And now, since I've been in front of people so many times, like I expect to get nervous. I know that the nervousness is coming, but I try not to let it rattle me. And I try to remind
Mhm.
myself that, like I've done the work up until this point, so I'm probably going to be fine, and there are worse things in life than stuttering, you know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
I just have to kind of like work through it a little bit.
Okay. So what would you tell somebody like has stage fright or scared to write out?
Yeah, yeah. So I think for anybody who has stage fright, because I have stage fright, you know what I mean? Like every time I'm about to get on stage, like I am absolutely nervous. Like my hands are shaking, my voice is shaking. Typically, what I try to do is I try to find a quiet corner, and I just like close my eyes. I breathe, because also like when you don't breathe, like the nervousness gets worse because now your body is sort of like going into shock because you're not giving it oxygen. So I try
Hmm.
to breathe, I try to remind myself that I've done the work up until this point. So there's nothing that I'm going to be able to do in these next couple minutes that's going to completely change the way that this performance goes. So I kind of just have to trust myself that I've done the work. If I forget the poem, it happens, you know what I mean? Like, and I figured out ways to recover from that too. So it's just kind of like, saying that, I've done the work, I've been through this a whole bunch of times. It's probably going to be okay. And I think we make public speaking out to be like this large monster.
Yeah,
And it's really, it's not that bad. Like if you mess up, it's fine. Like there are worse things in life than messing up.
yeah, definitely. And I think that's a good segue, just for anybody that is considering your workshop. A lot
Mhm.
of times people think they have to be a writer already, or an actor, or a writer who writes consistently. But I mean, your workshop is really able to all skill levels, correct?
Absolutely, absolutely. This one will be a little more advanced, right? 'Cause this would be my third workshop through Awful Good,
Mhm.
and my first two were very much like entry level sort of concepts, right? And of course I'm going to have a lot of those as well, but I also want to have something for people who have been writing for a while, maybe been performing for a while, and they're trying to figure out, okay, like how do I get to the next level of this?
Mhm.
So I definitely want to provide something that's sort of like in between, where somebody who has never written a poem before or has never performed before, I want to have something that's going to be able to speak to them as well, right? But I also want to look at, okay, like what are some of the things that some more people who are sort of like intermediate, who have already sort of had some experience with this. What are some things that I can give them to help them get to that next level? So it's going to be a little bit of both, right? So if you're somebody who's never written a poem before, there will be something for you at this workshop. And if you're somebody who's been performing for a while, maybe you've been on a couple slam teams, maybe you've already done a feature or two, there'll be something for here. There'll be something for you here as well.
Okay. So then
Mhm.
for you, this is your third workshop with Awful Good Writers. Then what is,
Oh, you were breaking up for a little bit. I couldn't hear you.
oh, I'm sorry. So because this is your third workshop with Awful Good Writers, what is your mission this time around for this workshop?
Yeah, so my mission is to introduce some concepts that we often don't talk about much in the spoken word community, right? So what I've been working on lately, right? What I've been taking sort of some time, since the shutdown and quarantine, is really learn more about form, right? And learn more about the page, because I'm very experienced with traveling and performing, and I can speak to that, of course. But I also have a very huge fascination with the page. Like, what are some things that people are doing that's innovative, with the written word as well? Like thinking about different forms. Like, I know at the
Hmm.
last workshop we did the golden shovel, right, and which is a new sort of popular form. But I'm also looking at cleave poems, like how to do sestinas, just like looking at different ways in which people use the page, because I feel like that's sort of an untapped thing in the spoken word community. So I'll be introducing a lot of those concepts as well, right? Not only looking at, okay, like how do we prep people for performance and how do we create spoken word poems, but also how do we, do some things that are really innovative on the page as well. I want to provide a well-rounded workshop. Like if you want to be a full-time spoken word artist that travels and performs in front of people, there'll be something for you here, right? But also, if you're not so much interested in the traveling and the performing, but you want to, publish, right? Like, I want to have a whole workshop about manuscripts and how to put one together, how to publish, what are some things to look for in a publishing house, the pros and cons of like publishing with a large publisher or publishing independent, right? Like I want to introduce a lot of those concepts as well, because I feel like that's something that we often don't get a chance to hear much about. And I know like a lot of times people, they have like questions for me and they want to like, they DM me or they email me, and I get a lot of DMs, I get a lot of emails, so I don't get to all of them. But I wanted to provide this opportunity for people who have a lot of questions and who want to get some insight, but, just don't have the access.
Hmm.
Mhm.
Yeah, awesome. And I know that your work is titled, Your Voice is Your Currency, correct?
Mhm, mhm. Yeah, your voice is
So,
currency.
oh, your sorry, your voice is. So
Mhm.
how do you plan on helping students understand that, really walk away with turning into currency?
Mm. Yeah, and I think a lot of the exercises, because I feel like sometimes people they don't understand how much their voice is worth. We think about some of the people that we admire, right? Some like the really brilliant public speakers or some of the really brilliant authors, and
Mhm.
we look at them and we say, we can never be that. We look at them like they're this anomaly, right? But a lot of times the people that we admire, they're just people who decided to publish, right? They're people who decided to make their work public. So I think about all the people who like hold things inside of them and they say, I can never be like on a level of a Saul Williams or an Andrea Gibson or a Javon Johnson. And I say, you know what? Like, let's find out. And the best way to find out is to sit down and write, is to learn some of the tools and to see how far your work can actually go. So I think the voice is such an important thing, and I think it is currency. It's worth something, right? And I think we all have one, so learning how to use it is, I think, is important.
That's awesome. No, yeah, I know from the last workshop we did, you kind of on that, but it really sounds more really bring for students in this course this time around, a little bit more.
Yeah, I definitely want to go into a lot more detail in this workshop because, like I think I was trying to cover a lot of topics in a short
Mhm.
in a short span of time. And I think this time around, I want to structure a little bit more so there aren't as many topics, but the topics that we do cover are very detailed.
Okay, cool. So we do have a couple of questions from people. So I just wanted to go ahead and ask. So the first one is, what's your favorite poem you've ever written?
My favorite poem that I've ever written, um, probably I would say my honest poem. Like that poem was it was a challenge from one of my friends, and like he was like, I want you to write something that's honest and that's just about you. And I was like, okay, like I think I could do that. And it sounded a lot easier than it was actually going to be.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, I struggled with it a lot because I don't normally talk about myself very much. So yeah, like I struggled with that poem, and it was a poem that by the time it was finished, I was like, wow, this is my favorite poem, because
Hmm.
it's the first poem where I really felt like this is the most me that I've ever put inside of a poem. So I think my honest poem is my favorite. Also, is my connection breaking up, or am I clear?
I see you okay. Why? Are people saying that your connection's not that good?
I was just wondering because somebody said that it was breaking up a little bit, and I just switched Wi-Fi providers, so this is like my first go around. I'm like, I
Okay.
don't know if it's great or not, but if I start breaking up, just like let me know.
Okay. No, I've been hearing you clearly. So sorry to everybody out there. For some reason, we're breaking up a little bit. Um,
Okay.
okay.
Oh, okay. Yeah, go ahead.
Let's see. So we have another question here. How do you know if you're a good writer or good at poetry? Ooh, that's a good
Oh,
question.
yeah, and I think with most things, right? It's so subjective. Like there's some people who, like there's certain poets, right, that people absolutely love, and then some people are like, oh, well, I don't really care for their work, right? So there's never going to be a time where you please everybody. When we think of like who are some of the most brilliant artists, that we can think of, there's always someone who's like, nah, I don't really care for their work, right? So I think it's less about being invested in other people's opinions, and it's more about you trying to please yourself, right? I think if I spent most of my time, figuring out, okay, so how do I make other people happy with my work, I don't think I ever would have gotten to this particular point. But what I really have to ask myself is like, how do I write things that make me happy? Like, how do I write the poems that I need to hear? And I think that's my biggest takeaway of it all is like worrying less about whether or not this poem is like good, right? And more about, does this poem do the work that it needs to? And do you enjoy it? I think that's the bigger question.
Oh, wow. Okay, so I'm seeing the comments. Everybody's saying the me. So let me
Oh, okay.
try and move. phone a little bit.
Mhm.
So sorry about that, guys. Technical difficulties.
Mhm.
I don't know how much better it can go, but let me know if it's a little better.
Okay.
Uh, are you able to hear me, Rudy?
Yeah, I can hear you. You were cutting in and out for a second, but I can hear you now.
Okay. Let's see. Sometimes it's just like trying to get like the right angle.
Yeah.
Okay. Let's see. Okay. How's that? I don't.
Yeah. You sound good to me.
Okay.
Mhm.
Sorry, everybody.
Mhm.
Okay, so let's just do maybe one more question before we get into the other questions I have for you.
Okay.
Um, so let's see. Oh, this is a good one. Which writing device do you dread most, if any?
Ooh. I don't know. I'm not very good at using onomatopoeia. It's just not something that I've ever really like taken the time to incorporate. And it kind of
Hmm.
just like seems like something a little more challenging than, what I'd like to incorporate into my work. I think for just to adapt the question a little bit, one thing that actually really like is daunting to me, right, are sestinas. Trying to write a sestina, like I sat down and tried to write one about a week ago, and it completely wrecked me. You know what I mean? So yeah, I would say writing a sestina is probably the most like daunting thing for me. Initially, it was cleaved poems, because cleaved poems, if you're not familiar with it, basically there's a partition in the middle, and so there's the poem on the left side, there's a poem on the right side. So that poem on the left side has to read as an independent poem. The poem on the right also has to read as an independent poem, and then it has to read across and make sense. So yeah, it's very much like a puzzle. And initially, that was like what I dreaded the most, but I've gotten a lot more comfortable with it. Sestinas, I'm still working through it, you know. But yeah, I would say Sestinas are probably like the most like daunting thing for me.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, you heard it every time. Rudy Francisco has things that he's with. So if you ever
Oh
feel
yeah.
bad, you're right. It happens to the best
Oh,
of them.
always, always. Like any poet that you admire, like you could ask them, like what are some things that are, scaring you right now? And they will probably have a long list of things that, they're just like terrified about. But like we work through it.
Yeah, no, definitely. So if anybody has more questions, we'll probably get to a couple more in the end. So make sure you go ahead and submit that. But I did want to go ahead, Rudy, just so we get to know a little bit more about you, because that's what we want to do
Yeah.
today. Um, how did poetry change your life? Like,
Mhm.
for a lot of poets, there's always something that impacts them more than just, I want to make money off of this. So
Yeah.
how did it change your life?
Um, I met some people through poetry that are my closest friends. Like they're like my family. Like namely, I'm speaking of Javon Johnson, Imani Cezanne, Teresa Siagatono, Natasha Miller. Like they're literally like my family. And I wouldn't have met them without there being a poetry community. So I think the biggest impact that the community has had on me is that I've met some people that have completely changed my life, like they are literally like my siblings. And also, even beyond the networking and the mentorship that comes along with, being in the poetry community, I think the fact that like I've grown so much, just by being in front of people and performing, like now I feel like I can walk into a room and, just speak freely and not be as anxious as I was before. Like
Hmm.
one time, me and my poetry collective Fiveology, we performed in Indiana Pacers Stadium, which is 30,000 people, and it's like after you perform in front of that many people, everything else kind of seems like, oh, like I can handle this.
Yeah.
And I think that's what being a performer has done for me. It's put me in so many places where I'm like, oh, I can handle this because I've already done this. Right.
Hmm.
I think that's been one of the biggest like tools that I've taken away from from being a performer.
Yeah, no, definitely. I'm a writer sometimes, guys, and I can definitely say that the hardest part about being a writer is because unlike other creative forms, not to put them down at all, because they all have their own level of difficulty, but there's literally no tools other than your like
Yeah,
you can only
definitely.
write what you know. There's no faking it. There's no to make it pretty or distract you from you. Like you have to know you to know how to write and how to articulate that. So I think it also helps you just find yourself
Mhm.
overall.
Absolutely, absolutely. And there's something about the level of authenticity that comes along with spoken word, right?
Hmm.
It's one of the, I feel like it's one of the few art forms that's still just very brutally honest, you know?
Hmm.
Because there's nothing else. There's no beat. Like there's no,
Yeah.
it's just you and a microphone. And there's something about like that sort of solitude that I think just makes people just very comfortable with honesty, you know?
Hmm.
And I think that's one of the reasons why, I gravitated toward the art form is that, it was like one of the few places where I was like, wow, like this is just so it's just so raw and honest and genuine. I love this, you know? So yeah, I think that was one of the things that really drew me to the art form to begin with.
That's cool. So, what advice do you have for new and seasoned writers?
Yeah, so I think my biggest piece of advice is knowing that your story is important. I think sometimes at least I could speak for myself. Like when I first got into writing, there were so many writers that I looked up to, and I was like, oh, I want to be like them. And I was trying to copy them, and people were like, yeah, you sound like so and so, or you sound like so and so, and I was like, oh, okay, like that's cool, but at the end of the day, I'm like, there's already a so and so. There's already all the people that I admire, they already exist. So the only way I can add to the craft is if I use my own voice, my own experiences, really taking a lot of like my story and implementing that into my writing. I think that's what makes an artist different from everybody else. Is like not only do you know how to construct the poem, right? But how do you add your own story in there to make it personalized? And I think that can be a huge difference maker. So my biggest piece of advice is understanding that your story is important. It's worth something, and you don't have to be somebody else to be important. Like you could just be you.
Hmm. Definitely. And something that kind of sparked thing that I know you've said before, which is that usually your best poems are not first drafts.
Oh yeah.
Do you want to talk a little bit more about that? Because I know, especially with professional writers such as yourselves, um, there's this common misconception that you write something and it's just like fire every time, and that's not
Absolutely
the
not.
case.
Yeah, it's really not, right? So for me, like the poem doesn't start to get good until like the seventh, eighth, ninth, maybe 10th draft. Well, what's funny is that I know sometimes, at least, and I'll speak for myself, is that like when I first saw Shihan, right? Shihan's a phenomenal writer. And I was just like, wow, like he's amazing. And when I first saw, a few of like the other poets that I admired, I just was like, wow, I was looking up to them and thinking like they've always been at this level.
Hmm.
And I think what's really important is to understand that everybody starts somewhere. You know what I mean? And a huge reminder of that for me is like, so I've been moving all week, and I was going through boxes, and I found a box of like my first like 30 poems,
Hmm.
and they are terrible. Like they are awful. Like I was embarrassed just reading them by myself. You know what I mean? But like most of the people who are on this live, most people who have seen my work, they've never seen those poems. So they didn't know that I started there and sort of worked my way up. I think that a lot of times when we see people, we're like, wow, they've always been this person, but really it's been a long journey. And I think understanding that makes you more patient with the process.
Yeah.
Like you don't have to, be absolutely phenomenal on your first shot, on your first try, but know that like you're going to get better, and you're
Mhm.
going to get to the point to where you look at some of the people that you came into this looking up to, and you're gonna say, wow, like we're kind of equals now,
Yeah.
And I think that's the journey, and not being discouraged that your first poem isn't like absolutely like blowing people out the water, because everybody starts somewhere. My first 30, awful. My next 30, probably also awful. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So it's definitely a process. You got to be patient with yourself.
Someone in the comments said you should post them.
Oh no, absolutely not. Absolutely not.
Come on, we want to see them. We gotta
Mm-mm,
gotta
mm-mm.
show the
You
growth.
know,
Try Tuesday.
I might burn them just so that nobody ever finds them. Like they're that bad.
Oh man,
So yeah, that's gonna be a no go for me.
you said that your first poem got applause from your classmates, so must have not have been that bad.
Yeah, but they were also, also 17 in about 1999. So I don't know.
Javon said he'll post some.
Oh wow.
That's
Here
funny.
goes Javon.
So we do
Yeah.
have some questions coming in. So someone said, "How do you get past judgment, the fear of ridicule?"
Yeah. And I think it's easier said than done, but at the end of the day, you have to write poems that you're happy with, right? And I think what's really awesome about going out to poetry readings is that it's not like comedy, right? Like where if you're not amazing at it, like people hate you, like that's one weird thing about comedy, right? If you're not good at it, for some
Yeah.
reason people want to fight you, right? But the spoken word community is not like that, right? Like we come to open mics to hear your story. Some of my favorite moments is watching somebody get on the mic for the first time. And even though the poem may not be like a 10, right? But it's so brutally honest, and it means so much to them that like everybody just enjoys the experience, like everybody comes to these spaces just to hear your story, and everybody's super supportive. So yeah, I think there may be, we're always worried about getting judged, and we're worried about the ridicule. But I think that's one thing about poetry spaces, is that people really just come to hear your honest truth, and I think that's what really matters. So even though being worried about ridicule is something that we all experience, but just knowing that, like, when you choose to share your poem, especially in a poetry space, like everybody's rooting for you,
Mhm.
so
Yeah.
so that's something important to keep in mind.
Yeah, definitely. Community is definitely there to have your back no matter what.
Yeah, definitely.
So we got another question here. Someone said, "How do you know when you're happy with your poetry?" That's a great question.
Yeah. So I know for me it comes in waves. Like sometimes like I'll write something, I'll be like, wow, this is amazing, right? And then I'll read it again, I'm like, this is terrible. So it kind of comes in waves, right? And I think for me, what really makes me say, okay, I'm happy with this poem, is I ask myself a couple questions, right? Like, what's this poem about? Um, what do I want this poem to do?
Mm.
Right? Who's this poem for? What is it for? And if I can answer a lot of those questions, I'm like, okay, like this poem is doing the work that it needs to. And I think sometimes we get obsessed over like perfection. And for me, like I see poems as living and breathing documents,
Hmm.
right? So for me, a poem is never completely finished, because I'll perform a poem the exact same way for years, and then I'll go back and I'm like, this poem could be better. And I'll take out some lines, I'll add some lines. So I'm less concerned with whether or not this poem is finished. And
Mm.
I'm more concerned with whether or not I'm telling my honest truth, and whether or not I'm honoring my narrative in
Yeah.
this moment, right? Because, in a couple of years, I may feel different about the subject matter, and I, may want to change some of the things in this poem, right? So for me, it's whether or not, like the poem's finished. It's not whether or not the poem's finished, it's whether or not it's truthful, and I think if it's truthful, then it's something that I like, it's something that I can stand by. So I think for me, that's the bigger question.
Yeah, definitely. So I'm gonna go ahead and take one question.
Mhm.
So what fuels your creativity, takes you into that world?
Mm. So I think for me, I had mentioned earlier that a lot of my friends are phenomenal writers.
Hmm.
So a lot of times when they're finished with the poem, they'll call me and they'll read it to me, and that's just super inspiring, just to like hear their new work, or when they publish a book, and I go out, I get it, and I read it, and I'm just like, wow, like this is phenomenal, and it energizes me to keep writing. I also try to look for poets that that may not be in my circle, because sometimes your circle can get a little homogenous, right? So I try to look for poets outside of my circle as well, and read their work too, just to see if there's something I can grab from it. A big thing for me was reading Obit by Victoria Chang. Victoria Chang was recommended to me by one of my friends, and Victoria Chang wasn't a poet that I had heard about before, but I picked up the book and I was like, wow, this is absolutely phenomenal, and it's different from how I write. So a lot of the subject matters are different from what I normally read, but the way that the poems are constructed and the overarching story that it tells has really like put me in a very different creative space. So I'm always trying to learn new things. I'm always trying to read authors that may be sort of like outside of what I normally read, just to see
Hmm.
if it inspires something within me. So that's how I try to keep the creativity going.
Yeah, definitely. Writers need to read more.
Oh yeah, absolutely,
Yeah.
absolutely, and also just go out and experience the world, right? Because I know sometimes we get caught up in I need to sit down and I need to write, right? And which is awesome, because writer, yes, you do need to write, but you also got to go out and like live. Because
Right.
if you're not going out and living, then you're not having anything new to write about. We write about our experiences, so it's awesome to lock yourself in a room and like do some writing, but also you can't forget to just go out and live your life.
Yeah, definitely. I agree. So
Yeah.
before we let you go, I did want to just give a quick shout out again to your workshop. So for anybody that's interested, it's starting this Monday, July 12th at 3 p.m. Pacific Standard Time for those of you that are somewhere else in the world. And the workshop is titled Your Voice is Currency. So you'll have access to private groups to discuss your poems and your workshops throughout each week of the course. It's going to be for 4 weeks every Monday. You're also going to have a Q&A opportunity
Mhm.
with Rudy Francisco. You'll be able to write new poems, share those poems, and you'll also get coaching and feedback on your writing and performance from Rudy Francisco. So was there anything else you want to add, Rudy, before we go?
I just want to thank everybody for joining today. This is really awesome. I don't do lives very much. It's probably like the third time I've gone live ever. So yeah, I appreciate people showing up, and I appreciate the questions, and hopefully, I would love to see a lot of you in the workshop as well.
Yeah, definitely. Don't forget to visit us at awfulgoodwriters.com and make sure you register for the workshop. It is 150, but again, it's 4 weeks, and you have exclusive access to Rudy and all of the other students that are going to be participating as well. So it's definitely worth it. All right. Well, thank you so much, Rudy, for coming on live. This is my first live ever, by the way.
Oh, really?
I hope
Okay.
um,
Uh-huh,
that
uh-huh.
I did well and that I did you justice as well.
Oh, absolutely.
And thank you to Awful Good Writers. Thank you, Rudy. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in. And hopefully, we'll see you on Monday.
Awesome.
All
Y'all have
right.
a good night.
Thank you. You as well.